Do things feel crazy to you right now? Do you feel that our whole culture is in an existential crisis? That's because it is. We are at a point in history where we absolutely must change the world. It will not happen within the boundaries of the system. It will require a confrontation, hopefully a peaceful, non-violent confrontation. I spoke to existential analyst Luke Kemp, who's a researcher at Cambridge University, who talked to me about the nature of this existential crisis, how corruption is only going to get worse, how inequality will increase unless there is an intervention, and how the system will never allow those interventions. Stay to the end of this video so that I can get your comments and feedback on how we can develop this conversation that began on my Luminary podcast Under the Skin, but will end perhaps with global change. What I feel like we've experienced, and given the title of your job or area of research, at least, like, it feels like what we're experiencing is an existential crisis that for me feels like a detachment from our MO and from our raison d'etre, like that we don't know what we are, who we are, or what we're supposed to be doing anymore. That we're like sort of bleached, blinkered, broken, atomized people that don't like that. People like, like Mark Fisher, of whom I'm a great fan, like wrote, he perhaps didn't coin the phrase, it's easier to envisage the end of, the world than the end of capitalism, but certainly it's sort of a theme that he wrote around a lot. And when, like, sometimes there's when you say, people aren't even doing anything about it, you sort of cite the kind of lethargy, but which Mark Fisher would have said it's not lethargy, it's a kind of people have understood, you can't do anything, there's nothing you can actually do. So what do we do, you as a younger person than me, and me as a kind of a very slightly older, still handsome, vocal supporter of agitation, opposition, activism, and a kind of optimism? What do we do? What ideas do you want to promote in terms of activism, protest, confrontation, and constructing arguments to oppose the kind of ongoing tyranny? Just one example or two examples being the surveillance state and the emergency laws that we've spoken about already. What should we do? And what do you think are good fronts to fight this on? Issues that will galvanize people and bring people together.
So first and foremost, I think we should note that you are deeply handsome and your facial hair is certainly superior to my own.
My heart jumped when you said that.
Secondly, if we are going to turn the tide on these very strong, robust trends, and that's not just simply the use of emergency powers and the kind of expansion of state capacity, but also deeper trends like inequality. One of my colleagues, Walter Scheidel at Stanford University, had this excellent book called The Great Leveler, where he tries to do an empirical exploration of how wealth inequality has trended over time. And his key and very compelling finding is that wealth inequality increases inexorably over time until you have a great leveler, which is a state collapse, mass mobilization, warfare, a bloody revolution, or a pandemic. And there's only two cases where that doesn't seem to be the case, where you actually had a reversal of inequality, or at the very least a stagnation of it, and it didn't require these kind of, quite violent ruptures. And those were both Athenian democracy and also, I think, Sweden during the antebellum period. I'll have to check that. When you had unions start to get represented within the parliament. In short, I think these are very deep and difficult trends, and so they're not going to be fixed just by, signing a petition online, nor by, changing who you vote for occasionally every 4 years. They do, I think, require very direct confrontational power. And I think this is why, for instance, in the UK, you've seen this really strong response since having things like Extinction Rebellion to actually try to curtail the ability to protest. The Crime, Sentencing and Policing Bill is in many ways a very revealing of what the state fears. So I do think that protest and confrontation is probably the most necessary ingredient for trying to actually stop these trends. And one of the things I argue for in the article is that we need to try to pursue emergency emancipation. So when it comes to emergencies and when it comes to crises, rather than trying to give the government kind of more leeway and practicing this kind of politics of, well, you can't criticize the government during an emergency because you can't politicize the emergency, we should do exactly that. We should actually demand more government oversight when these crises occur. And we should demand more involvement on behalf of citizens. And I think Ultimately, the key goal here should be to try to reform our democracy towards what's frequently referred to as deliberative democracy. So rather than having a representative who's picked every 4 years, you have a sortition or lottery across the entire citizenry. You have them picked. They can have either an assembly or a jury in which they're briefed by experts, and they make the policy decisions. And that both helps to control any corruption, because if you're basically only in office for a very short period of time and you're anonymized, there's really no one to lobby per se. And we also know that when you get citizens together and you give them good evidence and you give them the chance to deliberate, they actually come to remarkably good decisions. Their political judgment is actually very, very good. The problem is whenever we do this, we frequently just discard what they say, because they tend to actually say things and recommend things which are going to be effective in terms of addressing problems, but are not going to be politically palatable. And it's exactly what happened with the climate change assembly in France, where Macron, in response to the Yellow Vest revolutionaries, essentially said, okay, we're going to have this big democratic assembly. I'm going to allow for deliberative democracy to flourish. We're going to have this experiment, and I'm going to take on any recommendations they give. And so I had this over year-long assembly. They gave, I think, over like recommendations. These were very broad-ranging, and in the eyes of most experts, very effective and very kind of well-crafted. And Macron, I think, accepts like just a handful of them. And that's quite clearly because he knows they're going to be effective. And unfortunately, usually when it comes to addressing big global catastrophes, effective means challenging power. So in short, I think we really need two things. We need to have much more direct protests and confrontation and struggle. But on top of that, we also need to know the leverage points. And in this case, it's not trying to address things by issue basis. It's really trying to get towards changing how democracy is conducted. And I think the two big things which can actually unify people rather than divide them are A, deliberative democracy, actually saying, look, as citizens, you should have a direct say in how policies are crafted. You shouldn't just simply hand over the keys to a representative every 4 years who you have very limited options for in the first place. And B, wealth inequality. Pretty much everyone across the spectrum agrees that tax evasion is abhorrent and that tax havens should be shut down. Most people, when you actually, even on the far right, when you actually ask them what would be the kind of like ideal distribution of wealth or income, they tend to suggest something that's radically more egalitarian than what's currently in place in places like the US or across the world. So I really do think those two key leverage points, wealth inequality and deliberative democracy, those are things which can really change things. They're actually about leveling power, leveling economic and political power, and they're things that can unify rather than divide people.
Did you enjoy that from Luke Kemp? Would you like to see more videos from him? Do you think he looks a bit like Superman and he's a bit of a hunky guy? I certainly do. Let me know what you want to see more of in the comments below, and if you believe in the possibility of real and radical change, new ideas emerging from all of us to create, if not utopia, something surely better than this. Hit me up in the comments below, give us a like, give us a subscribe. If you enjoyed this video, have a look at this one, and maybe sign up to my Awakening side channel so you can develop yourself, nourish yourself with ideas that are not caught up in this mad political discourse. Sign up to my mailing list as well. And if you enjoyed this podcast, the whole conversation is available on Luminary, which you can get anywhere in the world from Apple. Stay free.